Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Monday, June 10th, and today is day 248 since October 7th. The situation on the ground in Gaza is dire, as indicated by the daily reports from humanitarian agencies that are working there or attempting to do work there. A few key highlights I wanted to share from the Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs: an Israeli military operation at the Nuseirat refugee camp, where 4 hostages were rescued 3 days ago, resulted ultimately over the subsequent 3 days in nearly 1,000 Palestinian casualties. Aqsa hospital in Deir al-Balah is operating at nearly 5-fold its capacity while surviving on only 1 electricity generator, and over 330,000 tons of solid waste have accumulated in or near populated areas throughout the Gaza Strip. That is a warning that came from the Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene cluster of humanitarian agencies. Humanitarian development specifically, and you hear this warning often when I share OCHA updates, Israeli bombardment from air, land, and sea continues to be reported across much of the Gaza Strip, resulting in further civilian casualties, displacement, and destruction of houses and other civilian infrastructure. Ground incursions and heavy fighting also continue to be reported across Gaza, particularly at the Nuseirat refugee camp and in Rafah. As of today, June 10th, intensified hostilities and military operations in Rafah have forced the displacement of approximately 1 million people, deepening the humanitarian crisis and significantly destabilizing humanitarian aid flows. This might sound like just words, but this means that families who have lost everything are packing up the very little that they have. They're having to relocate. These are families that are looking in the morning for water and for food. And they have limited energy. They have very limited resources, being displaced yet again. In response to the Israeli military operation and mass casualties at the Nuseirat refugee camp, Undersecretary General for the Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths described the camp as the epicenter of the seismic trauma that civilians in Gaza continue to suffer. He added, the images of death and devastation following Israel's military operation there have proved that each day this war continues, it only grows more horrific. Seeing shrouded bodies on the ground, we're reminded that nowhere is safe in Gaza. Seeing bloodied patients being treated on hospital floors, we're reminded that healthcare in Gaza is hanging by a thread. And even as 4 hostages are reunited with their families, we're reminded that scores are still being held captive. All of them must be released, and all civilians must be protected, and this collective agony can and must end now. And we stand alongside him and so many others calling for a comprehensive ceasefire immediately, that all hostilities would be brought to an end. The death toll in Gaza has now surpassed 37,000 people. It's at 37,124 people. And the injuries are at 84,712 injured in Gaza. UN agencies are reminding the world that by mid-July, which is just a month away, that over half of the population in Gaza, more than 1 million people, could experience the highest level of starvation by mid-July. This was reported by the Associated Press, coming from Cairo, saying that the United Nations warned that more than 1 million people could experience the highest level of starvation by the middle of next month if hostilities continue. In terms of hostage and ceasefire negotiations, it's being reported that Hamas is the only one who has not responded to the 3-phase deal that was proposed by the U.S. Secretary Blinken arrived in Israel today, and before departing, he said that the U.S. is urging world leaders to press Hamas to say yes to the proposal. The UN Security Council voted today and did approve the U.S. draft resolution that was backed that is essentially supporting the Israel-Hamas ceasefire proposal that was outlined by Biden. The resolution is aimed at halting the 8 months of fighting, and this resolution was approved by President Biden. It was finalized on Sunday, yesterday, after almost a week of negotiations among the 15 members of the Security Council. 14 voted in favor and 1 abstained, which was Russia. NBC News reported that the Biden administration has discussed examining the possibility of securing a deal with Hamas directly that could lead to the release of the 5 U.S. citizens who still remain held hostage in Gaza if the current ceasefire talks involving Israel should fail. Responding to the report, Netanyahu's office said Israel welcomes any attempt to free hostages. In a Knesset committee discussion, the finance minister Smotrich confronted family members of hostages held in Gaza, saying he will not support the current ceasefire deal because the organization is demanding the release of hundreds of murderers. He's referring to Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. He added that Israel will do everything in its power to release the hostages, but that the government should not agree to a move that is tantamount to, quote, a collective suicide. Senior Hamas official Abu Zuri urged the United States on Monday to pressure Israel to end the war with Gaza, saying that it's a movement that is ready to deal positively with any initiative that secures an end to the war. And a convoy of vehicles belonging to members of the Hostages and Missing Families Forum traveled from a junction in northern Israel to the southern city of Kiryat Gat, calling for a deal to secure the release of hostages held by Hamas. Shlomi Ziv, who was one of the hostages held that was just released on Saturday, was released from the hospital today. And a Tel Aviv court will discuss the state's request to renew the order to stop Al Jazeera broadcasts in Israel tomorrow. Yesterday, the order was extended by 45 days, but it requires the approval of the court. And Israel's High Court of Justice issued a conditional order instructing the state to justify why the law to stop Al Jazeera broadcasts should not be repealed. A rocket was launched from Lebanon into Israel, and it fell on a kibbutz called Manara that caused a fire in one of the homes there. There were a number of rockets fire exchanged on the northern border between Israel and Hezbollah. Again, today, 2 ministers from the Israeli government last night, Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, resigned last night. The resignations do not immediately threaten the Netanyahu coalition, but they could lead to more defections, and they also could embolden many of Netanyahu's critics. Gantz said that Netanyahu is preventing us, meaning Israel, from achieving a real victory. He said that Netanyahu has made empty promises rather than crafting a day-after plan for the war in Gaza and acting decisively against Hezbollah in the north and working towards a ceasefire and hostage release deal with Hamas. Western diplomats have voiced concerns about the growing influence of far-right actors within the Israeli government, and Gantz, who's considered a moderate, his resignation has only furthered those concerns. Blinken did land in Israel today. This is his 8th visit. He met in Cairo before stopping in Israel with President al-Sisi to discuss efforts to secure the ceasefire deal and the hostage negotiations. We've actually heard reports that the Rafah border has been almost completely destroyed on the Palestinian side. I've not heard that publicly reported. But Blinken is meeting with Netanyahu tonight, as well as Benny Gantz, who's the leader of the National Unity Party, who resigned. Blinken's comments about urging world leaders to pressure Hamas have been restated. He said part of the goal is to alleviate the terrible suffering of Palestinians. The top U.S. diplomat said Hamas is the only obstacle to securing an agreement on the hostage negotiation, despite concerns that both the militant group and Prime Minister Netanyahu may find ways to scuttle the 3-part proposal that is sponsored by the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar. Hamas has not yet given their response to the proposal, and so there still is waiting for that. You'll recall that Hamas has said they will not support a deal that involves the release of the hostages without assurances that bombings and attacks on Palestinians in Gaza will be brought to an end. And it's unclear whether the current ceasefire proposal includes an agreement for the fighting to cease, ultimately. The U.S. is close to finalizing a defense treaty with Saudi Arabia, but the move depends on Israel's commitment to a 2-state solution and ending the war in the Gaza Strip, according to the Wall Street Journal. So conversations continue with Saudi Arabia, and the Israeli Defense Forces have said, related to Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon, that they have continued to have attacks. 2 hostile aircrafts also fell in the Golan Heights on the Israeli side of the border. Hezbollah claimed responsibility for the launches, and 5 people were lightly wounded in a fire that was begun by Hezbollah drones that crashed into northern Israel. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Health Ministry in Ramallah said that a 15-year-old Palestinian was killed by Israeli Defense Forces in a refugee camp near Nablus. And according to Palestinian sources, another Palestinian was killed by Israeli forces near Tulkarm. and a trailer that is used by Jewish settlers who live in Sde Ephraim, an outpost located near northwest Ramallah, was set on fire last night. No casualties were reported. The family that lives in the trailer had by chance spent the night elsewhere and were not in the trailer when it was set on fire. The U.S. military has said that the Iran-backed Houthis attacked 2 European-owned carrier ships in the Red Sea. Both were damaged. And so that is an update from the first day of the week. Pray for a permanent ceasefire, not a temporary cessation of hostilities. Palestinians these past few days are saying, when will the world see us? It has been 3 days since 4 Israeli hostages were returned and rescued. They're now with their families, and we're so grateful for that. And at the same time, literally hundreds of Palestinians were killed. And each day since, more and more Palestinians are dying in Gaza because of limited supplies and continued attacks. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy.